Order, order. Good morning, and thank you very much for appearing before the Committee on Standards in its public evidence session in respect of the Committee's inquiry into MPs' outside employment and interests. If I may begin, could I ask what steps do you take to make programmes objective?
Good morning. I'm Tom Cheel, the Senior Managing Editor at LBC. We have a long history on LBC of really trying to bake in impartiality into how we conduct our programming. It might help if I just briefly touch on the nature of our output just at the very top. So we have a tradition stretching back to 1973 as the first commercial radio broadcaster in the UK, and we've always sought to put the audience at the heart of what we do. So we actively invite listeners to engage with our output, to debate topics of conversation with our presenters, and in doing so, we very proactively seek to ensure we achieve a range of views in any programme that we host on LBC. So we start from a position of a set of facts which inform a debate. There is scope for presenters to share a view or express an opinion on a particular issue, but we proactively invite, or they proactively invite the audience to engage with that point of view. They make it very clear that they want to hear from people who may disagree with a point of view. And we, more often than not, will prioritise those voices on air in order to ensure that any listener is in receipt of a breadth of different viewpoints on any given topic that we discuss. Primarily, we drive this through callers. We have hundreds of phone calls to more or less every programme on LBC, so we can cherry pick the most informed, best voices, those with the most relevant experience to the topic under conversation or debate. But partly thanks to the modern technology with which we're all now increasingly familiar, there are many other routes for audience members to engage with the programme should they not wish to phone in. So they can send emails to the studio, to the presenter, to the production team. They can engage through social media channels, text messages and WhatsApp. And that also enables us to present a rounded perspective on the topic under discussion and the subject that is being debated on air. Perhaps, Chair, just as a last point, if I might add, we have two news bulletins that are fixed in every hour. So we call it the top of hour in radio and at the bottom of hour. And those are delivered from a separate studio by a newsreader, which may or may not overlap with topics under discussion on the air at that moment. But that is the wholly sort of objective and impartial stories of the day that we deem to be important for our audience to hear.
Thank you.
I think Tom has covered it thoroughly, so I have nothing further to add there.
You'd have just said it, Ben. Do you want to introduce yourself
Sure.
as individual? Forgive me. In my eagerness to ask a question that the clerk had suggested, forgive me, just introduce yourself.
I'm Sebastian Enser-White. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Global, where I've been for 9 years, and Global is home to LBC, but also it's one of the leading broadcasters in the UK, so it's also home to Capital, Classic FM, Heart, to name a few. And in addition, we are the number one outdoor advertising company in the UK as well.
Thank you. Lovely. If I can turn to Neil.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning. What's the value in inviting sitting MPs to host current affairs programmes on LBC? And in particular, can you set out if there's a rationale or a difference between them being invited on as guests as opposed to hosts?
Well, we will, I think it's probably safe to say, invite MPs on as guests almost every day of the year. That is very much part of the sort of rhythm and tenor of the output, where they'll appear for, as I'm sure you're familiar, for short interviews on a particular issue. I think in terms of the specific role of MP presenters, LBC has always sought to connect the public with decision makers and people in positions of power and responsibility. So whether going back as far as Margaret Thatcher or through to Sir Keir Starmer, we've often invited prime ministers of the day and other leading political figures on air to answer questions in a phone-in format. I would say in the last 10 years or so, what has evolved through LBC is the opportunity for MP presenters to host programmes, and that affords them more time, and the audience more time, to delve in some depth into topics and issues of public interest. So if, for instance, someone were to appear for half an hour with one of our regular presenters, we would probably cover, in terms of topical questions from the audience, perhaps 6 or 7 calls in that time, and there may be other messages that come into the studio, as I described a moment ago. In terms of the space and time afforded by an MP presenter hosting a show across 3 hours, it offers scope for more direct engagement with the public, for the politician and the audience to engage at length, for people, frankly, to share more of their own experiences and insights with politicians, which I think is an important counterweight to the sort of soundbite culture that is often criticised in other parts of the media. And I think it's fair to say that we've seen a sort of shift in audience habits, in that there is clearly an appetite for this type of engagement with political figures. Whether it's the data that we see, which is that these programmes are very popular, we have hundreds of thousands of people tuning into them whenever we have politicians on air, or indeed through other evolving formats such as political podcasts, which are an opportunity for people to discuss issues at greater length. We see there being a clear audience appetite for this, and we think it's one way of meeting some of that audience need for LBC.
Thank you. Anything that you wish to add?
I've got a supplementary from Paula, and Paula.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here and giving evidence today. Just on the distinction between MPs being guests and MPs being hosts, how do you decide who you want as a guest, and how do you decide who you want as a host? I mean, I think as an MP, we get calls all the time to, pop along to various radio shows or television interviews or whatever. But I'm just wondering, what is it that then makes you go that step further and invite an MP to actually be a host?
Well, it's not something we rush into. It's normally quite a lengthy process. Typically, we will have had that MP on air very many times, initially perhaps as a guest, and then subsequently perhaps as for one of the more lengthy phone-ins that we conduct on air. And then it's really a question of sort of assessing the interest from the audience, the engagement, the way that person may connect with an audience, because that's clearly a fundamental for us. It's fundamentally radio, albeit there are many routes to consume it now, so we need to be certain that that person has it's partly voice. Have they got the delivery and the communication skills that we're looking for? Because that's absolutely fundamental. And also, critically, somebody who is open to being challenged, because to be frank, were we to have somebody on air who was parroting party soundbites for 3 hours, it would make for very dull radio. So we do need to make sure that anybody that we seek to engage on this basis will embrace the way that we do things on LBC, will be open to the challenge that at times will come through from audiences, and is happy to reflect a range of views on any given topic.
Thank you. Anything from you, Mr. Anselmi?
I think Tom has cut to the chase, which is that ultimately we are a radio broadcaster, so that it has to be something that will be appealing to our listeners, because really our success is measured on how many people tune in. So that's the key. I think also as a layperson, having been down to the LBC studios a few times, there is a technical element too. I'm not sure I would have, without a lot of training, the capability to host one of these shows. It's not just about sitting, taking phone calls, but they have to be watching the clock, making sure that they hit all the breaks, monitoring different screens, seeing what's coming in from their producers. So it's quite a technical background, and they of course need to understand media law, compliance, all the Ofcom regulations to ensure that what they're doing on air is impartial and certainly not libelous as well. So it's
just on that point about understanding all the legislation, how do you ensure when you engage a host that they are fully cognizant of all the legislation, for example?
Well, so that sort of speaks to the process that I touched on, that we will, if we think somebody has the potential to host a show, and I should probably say that there are times where we invite people to host a one-off show as part of what we call a guest host week, and then there's a stage beyond which historically has seen an MP presenter host a regular weekly show, if you like. We will sit down with our senior management team, be that me or one of my senior colleagues, and the individual concerned, sometimes the team that they work with too, to walk through the requirements of Ofcom's broadcasting code, the other media law considerations that Seb touched on as well. We will pilot people before we put them on air. That's not necessarily, a single moment. We will, if we feel it's appropriate, go through several stages of that to ensure that we are satisfied that we can meet our obligations, and fundamentally that is to our audience to retain trust in the output, but also to ensure that anybody who goes on air, whether it's an MP presenter or a regular presenter, is given the best chance of delivering what we're all looking to achieve for the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Mr. Francis.
Thank you, Francis Appian. I'm one of the lay members, so thank you for coming this morning. Do you think MPs acting as radio hosts could have a special authority in the eyes of the public?
Interesting question. I don't know if I'd call it an authority. I think for the period of time that they're on air and beforehand and afterwards, there's certainly a greater level of visibility or profile, I would say. I mean, I would point to the fact that because this is open and free debate across 3 hours, any presenter, be it an MP presenter or a regular presenter, is never entirely sure what somebody on the end of the phone line might say or bring into the conversation. So there is a degree of jeopardy that is attached to what these people are doing across 3 hours. So I'm not quite sure I'd call it authority per se, but I can see the point that the question is driving at.
What do you think the appeal for MPs is?
Well, I think some of them enjoy the cut and thrust of debate. I think it is, thankfully, on LBC, a large and very engaged audience. I sort of describe it often as Britain's biggest and best focus group. We're very grateful for the fact that we have so many people who are, engaged with what's going on in the world, interested in ideas. They have views and opinions that they want to share. We very deliberately invite them on stage with our presenters in order to have that conversation. And I think for people who are, as MPs, interested in ideas and public sentiment and what people think about particular issues or policies, I can imagine there's a real value to that. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying, but the current Foreign Secretary, as you may be aware, did host a programme on LBC, and he would say that people often think it's about talking. Actually, it's about listening, and he thinks that it arguably better equipped him as a politician to listen to the range of voices and views and perspectives.
Just in fairness to that person, how do you know he would say? Is that through discussions he's had with you?
That was, he said that, and he said it a couple of times at party conference.
Right. So it's on record?
It wasn't on the platform at the party conference, it was in a fringe event. So,
sorry to have interrupted.
That's fine.
So I think those are sort of some of what underpins the appeal.
Can I just check, the way you described earlier on about how you would ask MPs, in answer to Paula's question, ask MPs to come on the show, you're asking them because they are MPs. Is that right?
We are asking, well, in their guise, if as interviewees or as prospective MP
Well, if they weren't an
presenters?
MP, would you be going to the same set of people who were then going to act as radio hosts or indeed guests? Is it the status of them being an MP that makes them attractive to you to come onto your show?
Well, it's part of connecting our audience to the democratic process, so we think that's an important strand of what LBC does, and we think it is part of what makes our station distinctive. So it's whether as an MP presenter or inviting them on to field questions in a regular phone-in, or even as a guest. Those are three different routes that we think do have a value. Clearly, to a degree, it hinges on the fact that they are, representatives in Parliament. Yes.
One of the areas that have come forward in the submissions that we've been receiving is about caps on earnings and also the time that people spend not doing their parliamentary activities. How do you determine the amount of earnings or regularity that an MP might appear on your shows?
Broadly speaking, we have a fixed fee which reflects the amount of time and the preparation and commitment alongside the duration of the programme. In terms of the commitment that it entails, I mean, we have never had an MP present a weekly standard weekday programme on LBC. So typically it has been confined to weekends, sometimes where we have our guest host weeks, which run from Monday to Friday. Very often that will be in recess. So we're very alive to the primacy of parliamentary responsibilities, and we seek to work around that if we do offer people the opportunity to present a programme.
And just on that, do you think this work could be a distraction from the parliamentary duties of an MP?
I suspect an MP who's done it might be better placed to answer that. My feeling would be that it can enrich what they do as an MP within reason. As I say, we'll always make allowances for the parliamentary timetable, and I think that there is a value in connecting the public with their representatives. Particularly, and this is one of the most pleasing things, drawing in younger audiences as well. So I appreciate it's a fine balance, but I think there's a strong argument for saying it can draw in audiences and give them a better understanding of what's going on in Parliament.
You want to? Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Francis. Caris.
Good morning. I'm Caris. I'm also a lay member, just like Francis, and I'd also like to thank you for coming to speak to us today. Thank you very much. I'd like to follow up on one of Francis's questions, actually, because it's been suggested in the written evidence that we've received as a committee that perhaps MPs shouldn't accept paid opportunities to host or present if that's come primarily because of their membership of the House. What's your reflections on that suggestion?
Well, I think I would return to the fundamental point, which is that I think this means of communication with the public offers a really important avenue to reaching a broad cross-section of the public, and I think there's a long history, whether it's radio or other forms of communication over the decades, which has shown there's a value to that. I mean, we don't currently have any MP presenters on LBC, but I think we'd be reluctant to see that freedom too heavily curtailed, because for the reasons I say, I think there is a value to connecting the public with their representatives, done in a responsible way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I now turn to public perception, and my colleague Paula will ask you questions under public perception.
Yeah, so if we think about public perception of politicians when they're sort of hosting current affairs programmes, for example, do you think that they are perceived differently than a regular host on LBC, for example?
Well, we go out of our way to signal the fact that they are an MP before they even appear, before the mic fader goes up and they say their first word. So we will, through social media, through promotion ahead of that appearance, make clear that they are an MP. Thankfully, we've got a well-versed, intelligent audience on LBC, so I think they appreciate the level of audience expectation is such that they appreciate the difference between an MP presenter and a regular presenter. Now, as Seb mentioned a moment ago, the responsibilities of the MP while they're on air are the very same as they are for a regular presenter. But I think the audience appreciates that an MP can bring a set of perspectives or an outlook or an understanding of issues because of their role in Parliament to a debate that a regular presenter may not be able to draw on. So I think that's an important distinction. I'd also, just to go back to the point about the way the shows are formatted, we very clearly separate out the current affairs programming from the news bulletins that we have at the top and bottom of hour. That's signalled through the jingles and the on-air signalling that we provide for that. So I think there's an appreciation that in some regards MPs might offer an extra perspective because of their broader experience, but the audience are alive to that distinction.
Right. Thank you. I think we've covered that.
Yes, can we turn to the broadcasting code, and I can invite my colleague David.
Thank you. Clearly the role of parliamentary politicians is not necessarily to be impartial. So I wonder if you could outline what editorial steps you take to ensure that when an MP is presenting a radio show, that they are both impartial and accurate.
Well, we will, as I sort of touched on a moment ago, sit down with them well ahead of any broadcast, take them through the key elements of the broadcasting code. So for them specifically, Section 5, to which you alluded there. Clearly, if we're on the verge of an election, then it's a very different consideration and we wouldn't have them on air. But we will walk through the requirements of the code and talk about how we need to meet those. Again, the point that they need to be prepared to be challenged. That's how we can provide for our audience a broad range of views and perspectives on any given topic under consideration. Our callers are, they really lean into the debate. They're very happy to challenge the MP's perspectives themselves. And in coaching people as broadcasters and as presenters, we're very clear that, we're there to try and create the most interesting and gripping conversation, and invariably that comes with people exploring a debate from different perspectives. So it's very much baked into what we do. We've got very clear editorial and compliance controls. When we do have MP presenters in, we've got our most experienced output producers and executive editors overseeing that programming, and by the nature of the free-flowing conversation and debate that we have, if we feel that something does need to be addressed, we can do so very quickly. It's not a heavily pre-built program that requires, unpacking all sorts of other pre-produced elements. So those factors all feed into how we do things. And as I say again, we have that rich, constant influx of information and different views and perspectives that come through as messages to the studio, which also can broaden the perspectives expressed.
And I would just add to underscore what Tom said. they are, when we have MPs presenting, they are fielding calls from listeners. They're not interviewing colleagues. They don't have guests in or other parliamentarians. It is, and that to an extent ensures that they are kept honest. And helps remove the risk of an echo chamber or sound bites coming out.
We had a helpful session of evidence from Ofcom very recently, and they described their role as a post-broadcast regulator. Clearly they will receive a number of complaints, as I'm sure you will as well, from material that has been broadcast. How do you use that feedback from the audience to modify your editorial decisions around what an MP is contributing? So listening to the public in terms of how they're perceiving the role of an MP in broadcasting.
We do. I mean, we've sort of been keeping a close eye on the work that Ofcom is doing around this particular issue. We also, by the very nature of what we do and the level of engagement from the public, minute by minute, we can gauge as well from our audience a very good reading of how they feel towards this type of programming and their views upon it. And I would point to the way that LBC's approach has evolved. We are, as I said at the outset, the programmes that we do with MPs prove popular. We do think it's meeting an audience need. It clearly needs to be done responsibly, and we do keep that under review to ensure that we're doing it in an appropriate way for the audience. And a lot of the feedback we get feeds into that, and some of what Ofcom may choose to look at as well does so too.
You described the distinction at the top and bottom of the hour of cutting away to separate news provision. Are you comfortable and confident that recognise the difference between your news output and your current affairs output that the MPs are contributing to?
I think so, yes. I think we have huge loyalty from our audience, so they listen typically for 11 hours a week. They're very familiar with the format. I think the fact that we both refer to those news bulletins as the news, that is, the presenters will do so. We have the jingles, the on-air imaging that signify we're heading to a news bulletin. It's scripted as opposed to free-flowing conversation, so tonally it's different. I think there is an understanding that is an important part of what LBC offers, but it is distinct from the current affairs content, if you like.
I've got a supplementary from Gareth, and then I'm going to come to Rosemary, who has questions specifically about Ofcom. Gareth.
I was going to follow up on his point. Do you think there would be a distinction in terms of your listeners' understanding of what was being output if you were to have an MP being paid to present for 3 hours fielding phone calls? Would there be any noticeable difference in the quality of the output and the understanding of the listener if you still had an MP there for 3 hours, but rather than being a fee-paid presenter, they were a non-paid guest with somebody else curating those calls coming in who is an independent arbiter of what's happening?
I think it would. I mean, we in effect do a shorter form version of that, which I think is what you're driving at. I mean, I would say that across 3 hours, it would alter the nature of the conversation. I think radio is a very intimate medium. I think there's a great power in hearing a back and forth between two voices from a production point of view. For that duration, I think 3 might be a crowd. So as a product, as a broadcast product, I think there's a better case for having an MP who fully understands all those responsibilities while they're on air, conducting a conversation with a range of different callers, as opposed to somebody on the fringes who you're never quite sure if they might interject or interrupt the flow of a programme.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. And if I can move to my colleague Rosemary.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm Rosemary, a lay member as well, so thank you for appearing before us. Just going back to the Ofcom consultation, you'll know the consultation is out just now. Can I ask you what impact has that High Court JR in favour of GB News had on the work of LBC? Has it changed what you do?
I don't think it has changed how we operate at all. Obviously, we've monitored it closely. It's a slightly different situation. As I said earlier, we don't put MPs on air with other MPs one-on-one. We have a different setup where they're taking calls from the public. So we're closely monitoring it, but it hasn't impacted what we do. And as Tom said, as it happens, we don't have any MPs on air at all at the moment.
And as a follow-up to that, really, if politicians were restricted from presenting news in any type of programme, what would the implications be for LBC?
Again, I think day-to-day there wouldn't be any, and we really welcome, and we're still digesting the Ofcom consultation, but it explicitly says politicians are allowed to present current affairs programmes such as audience phone-ins and discussion programmes. So we don't think as drafted day-to-day it would impact. There is also in there an exception, so if it's editorially justified, there is an exemption. And I think Tom will be able to talk in more detail about where we see that happening, but were there to be a death of a monarch or something whilst an MP was hosting a phone-in, I think we would see that as exigent circumstances where, as a one-off, they may need to at least pass over to a newsreader. But no, we don't see any impact. As I say, we're still digesting it. There's many pages of detail, but on the face of it, we're encouraged by where they're landing.
Thank you very much. And lastly for me, do you have any idea of numbers of people on your books, for want of a better word, current MPs who would host one of your programmes?
None whatsoever. So we don't have any regular MP presenters currently.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. Does the committee have any further questions it might like to ask? Yes, I've got Michael and Sir Francis. Michael.
To clarify something you said about impartiality, do you view impartiality within programmes within that programme or within the totality of the output of LBC?
Within the programme.
Within the programme. And so the steps that you take to ensure that are what?
Well, they are that presenters need to ensure they are reflecting a breadth of view. They may have a particular opinion on a story, but they also then need to elucidate the fact that there are other viewpoints, and they can do that most obviously with callers, given the nature of LBC's output. There are alternative ways of bringing in those different opinions and views, as I talked about with messages and other forms of communication. You could also use the reporting team that we have to expand on a particular issue and say that, well, this might be an opinion that you've expressed, but there are also these views and other people say these things as well. So it's about ensuring that the audience in that moment, in that programme, is exposed to a different and a broad range of opinions. And
who manages that process? Is that the presenter or is it production?
It's presenter and producers with editorial oversight from the senior management team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir Francis and then Gareth.
Just interested as to why you've got no MP that's working with you at the moment. Is that a conscious decision, just a moment in time, or a reluctance on MPs because of what's going on with outside employment? Do you?
I think it's probably just a more practical matter that we've got a full house, as it were, on air at the moment of current slots. We just haven't had something open up where we thought actually perhaps this might be appropriate for an MP presenter. But it's certainly something that we think is an important part of the choice that we can offer audiences.
Lovely. Is there anyone else on the committee that would like to ask any questions?
That's my question, yes.
That's fine. Any other? No. In which case, is there anything else you might like to contribute to the committee as we undertake this inquiry? Any final comments, gentlemen?
I don't think so, no.
I think we've covered it all. Thank you very much for your time.
In which case, can I thank you on behalf of the committee for appearing before it in helping us undertake this important inquiry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you to those of you joining in the second panel of this morning's session into the Committee on Standards inquiry concerning MPs' outside interests and employment. Before I invite my colleague Michael to ask the first questions, could I just invite you to introduce yourselves, please?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to give evidence today. My name is Rose Whiffen. I'm from Transparency International UK. For those not familiar with Transparency International, we are an anti-corruption organisation, and we're the UK chapter of a wider movement, and we operate in over 100 countries. I personally work as a senior research officer in the UK chapter, working on political integrity.
Thank you.
I'm David Hine. I was Professor of Politics at Oxford, but I'm now retired. I'm a bit surprised that I'm still in one of these chairs, to be honest. I've sat in one for quite a long time. And in the latter part of my career, I developed an interest in standards in public life and the rising concern with the quality of democracy and nowadays the survivability of democracy. And I guess that's why I'm here.
Thank you.
I'm Alex Parsons. I'm a senior researcher at MySociety. MySociety is a charity that runs a series of civic tech websites in the UK and around the world. For the purpose of this committee especially, they work for you, and Right to Them is a key area of my work.
Thank you, and welcome to the Committee on Standards. Michael.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, good morning. I'm Michael Maguire. I'm a lay member of the committee. I have a question for the three of you, which is, how effective are the rules in the Code of Conduct in regulating MPs' employment interests? Maybe we begin with Rose.
So, overall, we would say that we very much welcome the recent changes on paid advocacy, which I believe this committee did also recommend. But we do think the current rules could be more effective. For example, the rules do rely heavily on transparency as an effective tool for accountability. But in that case, you need to ensure that the transparency is meaningful, that the public have easy access to the information registered. We also believe that the current rules, which allow MPs to take up second jobs, outside the boundaries of simply maintaining a professional qualification, do leave parliamentarians vulnerable to undertaking behaviour such as lobbying, which is expressly banned. And it does open them to corruption risks such as favouritism and quid pro quo arrangements. For example, as it stands, consultancy roles or non-executive director roles are still permitted. Our analysis using the most recent Register of Members' Financial Interests found at least 39 roles taken up by MPs which appeared to be of that higher risk bracket, and that are consultants, directors, advisors, partners and non-executives, and these roles were in industries such as property, energy, technology and finance. In a recent case that this committee will be very well aware of, a former MP was found in breach of the lobbying rules, and at the time he was undertaking a consultancy role for a private company. As was the case at the time of the investigation and is the case now, his activities advocating on behalf of the private companies is banned. But roles like these consultancy roles, do leave MPs vulnerable to performing lobbying tasks. Were this secondary employment not permitted, the potential for wittingly or unwittingly straying into an advocacy role would be removed. A simple solution might be just to simply ban consultancy roles or similar high-risk roles, but we do understand the practicalities of a solution like that. The rules can't specify every single job title that an MP could or couldn't take. And you might have a sort of a whack-a-mole situation where you have a role to get around these rules, which becomes, sort of strategic marketing advisor, and, just keep adding and adding. But we do believe that to protect MPs from slipping into or knowingly undertaking lobbying activities, all second jobs should be prohibited, except those that maintain a professional qualification or provide an essential public service. We also believe, in addition to this restriction on secondary employment, that there could be a strengthening of the current lobbying rules as well. So currently, the definition of a financial or material benefit, as stated in the rules, has to be interpreted narrowly. But we believe, and we've also previously recommended to this committee in the Code of Conduct consultation, that it shouldn't just be about whether or not the MP could be advocating on behalf of just the specific company that employs them. We do think that if they are lobbying on behalf of the wider sector, that would still incur a financial benefit on that company, and so should also be banned. So those would be our two largely our two improvements would be restrictions on second jobs and also strengthening lobbying. We also do believe there's some transparency improvements that could be made, which I'm happy to elaborate on later on.
Thank you.
I'll be brief. I think in a historical perspective, the rules work pretty well and things have improved gradually over time. If we get back to 1992, 2008, when there were major, as it were, discontinuities in the rules, things have enormously improved. And I think in international comparative perspective, the system works pretty well. And for my own part, I wouldn't change the partially self-regulatory elements of the process. I think there are risks. I absolutely agree that the transparency risk is problematic, and in some ways the more information you put out there, the more it can be misused. So that's clearly a problem. I think many of the problems that we grapple with when we look at parliamentary standards come from a situation where actually the rules are quite adequate. The problem is the individual, and that brings Parliament into great discredit. And that very often happens towards the end of an individual's career. I mean, we can't discount the fact that political life is up and then down. Sometimes it's spectacularly down, and it's pretty insecure. And at the end of a period of disappointment, or towards the end of a period of disappointment, you may move from what looks like a perfectly respectable piece of consultancy to a much more questionable form of activity, and that clearly gets Parliament's reputation into trouble, even though the rules, strictly speaking, prevent it. And I don't think you'll be able to do much about that, except through better training, better awareness, better dialogue between the committee, the commissioner and others, to try and make more and more MPs aware that at any stage in their political career they must have proper regard for Parliament's long-term reputation. So I think, my answer would be it does pretty well. Clearly we're going to talk about areas where there are issues, probably transparency, probably the question of whether you can make something of the principle of full attention. And those, I think, are certainly areas where something needs to be looked at, if not also done. But I'm not convinced that it's a disastrous situation that we're trying to deal with, notwithstanding what happened between 2019 and 2024. Thank you.
So I think there is a sort of a mixture of questions here. One is in terms of what is the purpose of the rules. And if a question is the goal to align the role of an MP with public expectations of what an MP does, in which case there remains a significant gap between the allowances for second jobs and the expectations of MPs as a full-time rule. Going by YouGov polling, there's very few second professions that have majority support. It is pretty much just doctors and maybe authors. So even other professional regulated ones such as lawyers is not seen as in great esteem. Similarly, even for GPs, there was an interesting survey experiment that sort of had a penalty for increased income from MP for a GP as it went up to being more of a full-time job. So in terms of like the distance between the current rules and that sort of like strict, there is one job, there is still a significant difference remaining in the rules. But even in terms of the rules as they exist, as the others have spoken to, there are significant transparency problems. One of the things we've done this year is we worked with a group of volunteers to go through the register, where our expectation would be we would add details that weren't available in terms of like, what does this company do, what does this company do? But what we actually found in practice was it was very hard to answer questions about a range of second jobs because the basic information in the register was not up to date, had not been changed recently. Even jobs that should be relatively straightforward, like is this MP also continuing to be a councillor, we found very difficult to answer with updated information. So our sort of two things would be that there is a question about if transparency is enough to align MPs' behaviour with public expectations, and if that is the approach, how transparency can be improved to make that more the case.
This is the new register you're talking about?
Yes, this was reviewing the September 2024 register. So there was a initial good set of, as a lot of new MPs joined, a good set of disclosures about what was the state as of after the election. But what we were looking at it coming into January was a lot of things where we would expect to have seen an update. Is this ongoing? Is this not? Was not quite as we'd expect to see. So basically there is room to be done in terms of just making sure that these things are regularly updated to be clear about what those second interests are if they are to continue.
I mean, clearly there are arguments for and against further regulation. I mean, what do you think this committee needs to keep a focus on if deciding that further regulation is required? And I'll maybe ask David this time.
Well, I think it's going to be steered in any case by the Modernisation Committee, so perhaps we should start there. I have to say, I've got a lot of sympathy with the full attention principle, and I do think that some of the reputational damage that has been done to Parliament has been the result of the public finding it, or rather those who interpret things for the public, finding it very hard to believe that anything like full attention can be given to the role of the MP as an MP if they have such very high earnings. And so if you're to get on top of that, I think something needs to be made of the full attention principle. I worry about it, however, because if I can trip to the other side immediately, because I think it's very difficult to enforce. I've read carefully what the Commission has said about that, and I understand all the issues of enforceability that surround it. I understand that as a principle, as opposed to an enforceable rule, it may actually have quite a strong behavioural influence, and I hope that that would be the case. But it does seem to me that some more attention needs to be given, I'm sure it will be given, to the question of giving at least some stronger indication of what full attention means. And I think there are various ways of going about that. I'm happy to go into that now if you want to. And I think that the problem is you can justify outside employment in two ways. One is what sort of previous professional experience is useful to Parliament and enriches its life, and we hope ensures that the people who are selected for Parliament include those who have been through strong and rigorous and useful training processes. I have to say I have some doubt about that. The selectorate process is pretty serendipity very often. But that's one way of going about it, justifying it on the grounds of a selected list of occupations. The other way is obviously to say, full attention does not mean that's the only thing you do in life, with which I've got a lot of sympathy, I have to say. We all have other lives, and the question is, how do you make that reasonable? In my professional life, I saw lots of people doing other things throughout their career. Most of them behaved pretty reasonably and understood intuitively what the limits should be, and that they could, as it were, enrich their academic career by doing some other things, but some behaved outrageously and ignored their duties. And the question is, how do we communicate to those people that they must not behave in that way? I don't think it helps if in academic life you don't earn £500,000 a year, but in some walks of life you can, and it doesn't help at all public credibility that you are being cognizant of the limits that private life imposes on you if you earn very large sums of money. The transparency of earnings means inevitably that we know, and the way in which this is mediated to the public means it's exaggerated and manipulated for the purpose of the person who's communicating it. So it's bad news. And I don't know how you get round that, except to say private life only consists, my view, of 1 day a week, and no more. And 1 day out of 6 or 7, depending on which way you look at it, is not very much. And I think that there should be some sense in which MPs are required to say, yes, that's how much time I'm spending on this, and no more. And I think that would be some kind of reassurance. If you then earned £500,000 in your 1 day a week, people might start to wonder whether you were telling the truth. But ultimately, it's got to fall back on how much damage an MP is willing to take. And as I say, that'll depend on what stage in his or her career he or she is. May be very difficult to do, but I do think that some substance has got to be put around full attention. When I wrote a paper for you, I thought it could probably be done by sort of defining the sorts of occupations. I'm doubtful about that now, but I think indicative limits on earnings or hours is...
Just say you're doubtful about that now?
Yes, I'm sorry. I mean, I thought about it more. I've looked at what...
You want to correct your written submission?
If it counts as evidence, I'd better do. When I wrote it, I have to say, I'm out of this game for a rather long time now. I hadn't really thought of it quite as evidence, my opinion, as a rather old observer. But, I mean, I think we all have to... I'm sure that you agree that we're in an iterative process where we work through these things, and if you change your mind, then you should put your hand up and say it. And I see a lot of difficulties in fairness and in any case good sense. I think there are loads of ways in which you can be useful to the House. And more importantly still, I think political life is very short, nasty and brutal as well sometimes, and you've got to give MPs a reasonable prospect that they will have a life afterwards.
In fact, one might argue it's extremely volatile, and that the days of 20 plus years serving as an MP might be fading into the distance. Does that add weight to your evidence?
Well, I guess it would, except that wasn't my evidence. My evidence went to the opposite direction. But we must be permitted to change our mind on that. I don't think I would change my mind on the hours or earnings or something like that, some kind of scale which would give MPs a guide to what they might or might not do, and also what the public can say is a reasonable expectation as laid down by Parliament.
Thank you. I know that Anna's got a supplementary. Michael, you haven't finished yet, have you?
No, I'm interested in Alex and Rose's response to this, because, I mean, just what you're saying, David, clearly there is a potential benefit to Parliament and having MPs with outside interests, experience that they bring, and the opportunities for the next career and so on. How do you, presumably you have a different view, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a completely opposing view to that. I think that the carve-out that we do have in our recommendation for professional registrations and public service is a way to try and create that balance between wanting to ensure a diverse pool of candidates to be MPs, but whilst also addressing the clear corruption risk which having secondary employment does present. You know, you asked where you think regulation should focus on, and you know, as an anti-corruption organisation, we are concerned with the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, and how it relates in this circumstance is, and what we're particularly interested in, is how the code of conduct can deter MPs from acting for private interests, and these private interests may be a secondary employer, or their own private interests, businesses they own, for example. And we want to avoid as much as possible MPs having a conflict of interest. These conflicts of interest may manifest when they are speaking in a debate, for example, and where the topic relates to an interest, that they must ensure their contributions align with what's best for public policy. And connected to this, we want to avoid a situation where businesses have undue influence over our politicians, which could then distort public debate and the policy-making process.
Could I just,
yeah.
Sorry, forgive me, could I just ask, because you touched on it for the second time, about sort of unwitting advocacy. Do the rules on declaration as distinct from registration not currently address that risk?
We do think that the rules on declaration, you would have seen that in some circumstances in the past year or so, there are MPs who have found to be in breach of those rules. So they're not being followed all the time. But also, we also think that declaring is not necessarily enough to mitigate the corruption risk here. We also do think there needs to be a strengthening in the lobbying rules as well, as I mentioned about there being not this sort of narrow interpretation of what a financial interest is. So as it stands, we don't think it's mitigated enough with the declaration rules.
Thank you. I know that Anna wants to come in, Michael. Can I bring Anna in? And is that okay? And I'll come back to you, Anna.
So I didn't want to go down a kind of rabbit hole, but I just wanted to quickly touch on the kind of full attention point. And we've talked a lot here about how we're not really employees, we're post holders as MPs, and we don't have a job description, and no one tells us what time we're supposed to be spending. We might all have a sense of what full attention is. And it strikes me that an MP could not have a second job, but still, in my mind, not be spending their full attention on being an MP. They could be golfing or doing whatever they want. They get held to account by the electorate. And I wondered whether you'd given any thought as to how one might measure or quantify or investigate what full attention looks like. You may not have done in which case.
I've had thoughts, but I mean, I think it's a pretty tough call. I mean, I did say in my paper that there are many different ways in which an MP is fulfilling her responsibilities, and obviously people choose different routes. Some are happy to be on the back benches for a long period of time and spend a lot of time in their constituency. So the moment that you started to create a kind of algorithm, a calculus of these things, I think you'd get into trouble. Using the term full attention as a principle in a if you like, code of conduct, it seems to me runs the risk that the public believes this to be your full-time job, even though I agree being a representative, an elected representative is not necessarily best seen as a full-time job. Actually, after IPSA came along and started to pay you salaries, I think you get closer to being full-time employees, and I don't think there's any getting away from the fact that that's how the public sees it. And if we're talking about trust as the ultimate problem, then they do see it in that way. So I think you've either got to say, yes, Parliament is enriched by activities while the person is an MP that can be useful, and it's quite easy to reach for a list, of good things, like the Army Reserve or being a doctor or dentist or whatever. I mean, I would enter the caveat there that I think there are plenty of potential risks in those areas too, actually. I mean, if you think about the health service and the gradual privatisation of the health service and the way in which people with medical backgrounds and roles might be tempted to advocate certain outcomes in public policy, then you can see that's just as much a risk as in business. Indeed, it is business. But I think the real problem is that it's hard to discriminate between different roles and different jobs, and therefore I think you've got to fall back on the private life bit, which is what we all do, apart from our roles. Possibly many of you think you don't have a private life, but you do, somewhere. And I think that's the justification, which is why I think you have to put some kind of limit on it.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe just like Alex to respond to that. I mean, you can't. There's risks in everything we do, and from what Rule says, yes, there are potential risks, and MPs have an outside interest, but you can't mitigate all risks. So, how would you respond to that?
So, I think the way to understand risk in this sense is collective, in the sense that very few, like if you ask this question in 1992, you get very, very different answers, because lots more MPs at that point had much more second employment. At the moment, the number of MPs with substantial second employment is not massive. And I think I'll talk about collective benefit there in a second, but there is mostly the benefit that is private to that MP, whereas the risk, the reputational risk, is collective to Parliament, to all MPs. So that is sort of the sense of the question of the rules is like, how do you mitigate that sort of collective risk of headlines about corruption, headlines about second jobs, when most MPs do not have personal agency to stop that happening because they don't take those jobs. And the ones that do derive a substantial, well, a very financial benefit from it, but that is a lot of the private benefit there is private to that MP. So that is sort of the goal of these rules, is to weigh up restricting that private benefit versus the collective risk of, as Rose says, corruption risk in general, and also that reputational risk to our MPs working for their constituents or their secondary employers going on there. And just to come back to that sort of question about the benefits to Parliament from secondary employment, I think these exist in the sense that people have experiences and stuff, but are these the only ways of getting those benefits? If you set out to create a Parliament that was in touch with a range of occupations, a range of different expertise, would you say everyone should go pick up a second job? Or would you devise new ways in which people could stay in touch with a set of sectors? MPs do a lot of work talking to people in the constituency, talking to people in their previous professions. So that would be sort of my question about the collective benefits of MPs with second roles, is can you get those benefits in better ways that do not have the substantial risks associated with second employment?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to move on to Rosemary, and then I'm going to touch upon principles-based. Rosemary.
Thank you. In many ways, I think this follows on, you've mentioned this already, about defined lists and what that might look like or what it might not look like. What sort of roles and occupations do you think, if any, should be exempted from a potential prohibition on outside employment, and why?
I can take that first, yep. So I think I've sort of mentioned earlier that the main exemptions would be roles which maintain a professional registration. I think nurses, it's about 150 hours that they have to work per year, I think, all which provide an essential public service, may they be army reservists or lifeboat services. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, to maintain that balance between avoiding conflicts of interest and also ensuring doctors and nurses, for example, do become MPs. To go down a small rabbit hole, I'm aware that in some of the submissions to this committee for this particular consultation, there was some criticisms and issues with those MPs who currently own their own businesses and who also are doing several hours per week or per month maintaining those businesses. You might have noticed that the recommendation I've outlined doesn't have an exemption for directors and business owners. And this is because there is still a conflict of interest that would be live if continuing those directorships. And there is still the opportunity to use the privileged position that is being an MP to lobby ministers on behalf of their own company. And secondly, we do worry that if we had it as an exemption, it might become a bit of a loophole for other paid employment. On the other hand, we wouldn't, as we've discussed, deter candidates who have business backgrounds. That's very important experience to bring to the table. And we wouldn't also want MPs' businesses to suffer. But to this end, we've been thinking about how to balance those two areas. And we think that perhaps this restriction which we're putting forward, there could maybe be sort of a 6 months pause or sort of a transition window to allow the parliamentarians to introduce arrangements that would mean that they're not involved into the day-to-day managing of these businesses whilst they're an MP. And also additionally, it's worth noting that we're not saying there should be a restriction on any shareholding, so they could maintain shareholdings obviously in their businesses. So yeah, the two main areas are ones which maintain professional qualifications and essential public services.
Any other views around a prohibition and that list, and how that might enact really in how it looks in our code of conduct and how that might be maintained?
I don't necessarily disagree with anything you've just heard. It's a balance. I certainly think for people with businesses, you probably need a transition period. Otherwise, you may well be deterring people who you find valuable. I wouldn't want to think that because somebody had built a business and shown the range of skills that are required to build a business and be successful, that they that class of potential MPs is somehow or other more deterred than others because the transition arrangements are going to be pretty formidable for them. I also think probably, notwithstanding what Rosie's just said, that if you're a shareholder and you have prospects of going back into business, you're probably under rather similar sorts of pressures. I mean, my worry is the more you think about these things, the more complicated it becomes to exclude almost anybody, and that it's better really to fall back on the declarations and the prohibitions that the existing code of conduct offers. So I guess I'm a bit limp-wristed on this. You know, I can't really think of a way of getting a satisfactory list. I mean, it might be, and I've come to that conclusion since I wrote my evidence, I repeat, by reading better evidence, I think. So I'm not sure. I think you may get into trouble. I think it might be quite controversial. I could imagine it might even be divisive in the House, that some people are able to do things that other people are not. But for me, most importantly of all, as the chair said, life is nasty, brutal, brutish and short, and you can't expect to be here. You may not be here in 6 months' time, any of you, you know. We don't know. So I do think you've got to have some reasonable prospect. Otherwise, I think the pool from which you're going to draw MPs, which I think already is, problematic in some respects, but that's a question for selectorates, party selectorates, not for this committee. That pool is going to get narrower and narrower. And I think that will be a huge loss to public life.
Thank you. Alec, do you want to add anything?
Just that there is, well, there are arguments for more expansive lists. There are several advantages of a relatively tight list in terms of being able to clearly enumerate exemptions, but also in terms this does more clearly align with the public evidence or public expectations that the number of exemptions should be relatively small. I think there is inevitably going to be, we can start with a few principles and then there will be weeds to get into, but that's kind of the job of working through it. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't go, just because there is going to be a footnote that explains things in more detail, doesn't mean it's not a good idea. So that was sort of my sense of that it is a relatively, there will be problems posed for individual people, but over the course of 10, 20 years, this will work itself out naturally in some respect. So there is, I think there is a lot to say for a relatively restrictive list, as Rose talks about.
Thank you very much. I'll hand you back to Chair.
Thank you, Rosemary. Before I come to Mahmood, I think I just wanted to touch on what you've already discussed, Professor Hine, which is principles-based approach. Yeah. I just want to flesh that out a bit. Because the committee, of course, has received evidence from you and others about proposed principles-based approach to implement a qualified prohibition on outside employment. Can you just expand on what your views on these principles are? Would they capture the right type of secondary activity? Do you think that they could be effectively enforced? And if so, how? And are there different principles that could work better than others? Would you like to expand on the principles-based approach that you've suggested?
I think you have three principles that you're working on, don't you? One is no monetarisation, kind of automatic, almost monetarisation of your role as an MP. You must not take a job that's offered to you simply because you're an MP and couldn't be offered to somebody else. And the other one is conflict of interest, which is, I think, relatively cut and dry. I don't have problems with either of those two principles, and I'm pretty sure that they are enforceable. Not that enforcement is something you reach for immediately, it's the last resort, and actually there aren't that many enforcements in that sense. Out of 640 or whatever MPs who are present in the Palace of Westminster. So, I think that would work, and I come back to the fact that when things go wrong, they often go wrong despite the rules, and it's hard to imagine what the rules would be that would have stopped that individual doing what he or she did.
Well, if somebody's corrupt and they're corrupt,
no
amount of rules is going to stop.
Yes, that's right. And you're very lucky to be in this legislature rather than in quite a number of others. And that's because of the socialisation process and because of decades of building a code of conduct, which I think does actually largely work. Notwithstanding what we see as the long-term decline of trust, I wouldn't have thought that there's a parallel long-term decline in behavioural attitudes inside the House of Commons. So, I mean, that's the first one. The conflict of attention principle worries me a lot, because I don't think it's really enforceable. I think the Commissioner has said that he can't quite see how he could enforce this. So even if I even if I recommended that there was 1 day a week and no more than that, and a limit to earnings and so on, there might still be a problem because I think these would have to be indicative rather than full, and I wouldn't envy the Commissioner's job in trying to enforce the full attention principle. It does seem to me that of all of them, it's got to be something which is internalised by MPs, and there will be bad apples. And there's not much you can do about that except continue with the life that you lead in the Standards Committee, with its independent independent advisors, outsiders, members, with the Commissioner, with the Commissioner's staff, with the Registrar and so on, all those things, and with a bit of luck, more training of MPs as they come into Parliament, although that's not the end, that's the vulnerable end. I think it's the other end when they go out. That's the vulnerable end. But I think all those things are the way to do it. But if you are going to have that principle, I think you've got to face the risk that the public says, or those who interpret things for the public says, here, it says here, everybody's got to work full time. And yet they're not. And they're earning a certain amount of money. This looks like you're not enforcing your principle. And I don't quite know what to do about that, other, as I say, than to have some indicative and relatively modest limit on how much time you spend, and hope that you can persuade people to do that. And by the way, if KCs are inhibited from becoming MPs for that reason, if some MPs are inhibited, I don't think that's a great loss. I'm sure there are plenty of other KCs who are quite happy to do equally as good a job without needing to earn £500,000 a year as well. That's my view.
I think for conflict of attention, I think most MPs in this committee might well agree that we're well aware of the conflict of attention to our private lives and how it always suffers as workaholics that we all are. But do the other
can't resign from your private life, I'm afraid.
Are there any other comments on principles based from the other panellists? Can I start with Rose, please, then, and then?
Yes, thank you. So I think that these new principles, there's been lots of thoughtful considerations, and we do welcome them into this debate. Ignites some really helpful conversations. Just to sort of give our perspective on sort of a principles-based approach, we do see that rules and principles working in tandem is the most effective way to ensure integrity and avoid corruption risks. Principles have been found to be effective in norm setting and culture setting, and they're also important as, obviously, you can't set a rule for every single eventuality. But that being said, principles only go so far, and rules create that clarity and clear expectation, as well as a mechanism for parliamentarians to be held account. In that they can be investigated when broken. So we wouldn't necessarily disagree with the principles that have been set out, but we would see them more as complementary to a stricter rule on outside employment rather than a substitute. And to echo some of David's points, when introducing a new reform, it's very important that the public see that it's working, and I think this is a similar point that you were making. If it's a new principle and the intention is that it's going to ensure more integrity, the public are going to want to see that it's working, and thus you do need a clear enforcement mechanism for that. Yeah.
Alex?
Similar points in that, as you say, if someone's corrupt, they're corrupt, and so to an extent you need processes that can deal with people who are not going to. I think there's a risk with some principle tests of making it about character, and that works for 99% of people. For the people who do not have character, it does not catch them at all. So I think it is important to sort of have systems that are independent of someone saying, this role I have taken is not corrupt, because that is not enough to actually stop people who are really going through the system. What I sort of say is, in general, we want to think about this as like systematic risk and rather than individual risk. So I think a focus on like individual roles can sometimes sort of lead down a path where it's hard to validate what someone's doing with that role, although there is currently the Parliamentary Commissioner can ask for people's written descriptions of jobs. I think in general it would be useful if that was more generally published, given that there is no particular reason to be that constituents shouldn't have access to a contract if that exists for their MPs doing separate work. But in general, I think the question to ask is the risk of the organisation employing them rather than the specific role they hold. So, for instance, you could imagine a situation where effectively someone has a semi-fake job. There's a job description. That's not what they do. What they're doing is contacts. What they're doing is asking parliamentary questions. That goes, every single question you can ask them about their written contract, it doesn't matter. But if you ask questions about the organisation that's employing them, do they take parliamentary contracts? Do they take government contracts? Do they separately lobby Parliament? Those are good indications of the corruption risk of the role. In general, regardless of if it's a benign role or is a corrupt role, that is sort of the question about the collective risk being asked here is this an organisation, regardless of what people say they're doing, that you want employing an MP? And so I think that sort of principles-based approach, looking at organisations and asking questions about the organisations rather than what MPs specifically do, is a helpful way of cutting past some of these questions.
Thank you very much. Before I move to Mahmood, I've got David that wants to ask a supplementary question.
If I can, please. David, you touched on the first principle that you highlighted was that members shouldn't monetise their membership at this place and shouldn't take roles that have been offered to them just because they're MPs. We've recently heard evidence from broadcast media where clearly people are employed because they are MPs. Do you have a view on that?
Lots of views. I imagine it's a minefield because of the risk that you appear to be suppressing freedom of speech, and that's the sort of critical underlying problem. I have to say, I feel uncomfortable about the idea that somebody who is an MP presents news and chairs sessions. I don't feel at all uncomfortable about people writing anything and probably being paid for it, although there may be some issues there. But I do think the media, and particularly new social media and the monetisation of that, present real risks. And there's lots and lots of research out there about, and I think probably my colleagues here know much more about this than I do, but lots and lots of research about how social media is now able to target particularly sensitive electoral groups, and that individual politicians play a role in this and get money from it. There's a very interesting piece of research on the recent German election, which is hair-raising in the way in which social media was used in that election. But I think more generally that's ultimately social media is probably the bigger risk than conventional media. I don't quite know how you go about dealing with it, though. I mean, there was a case in the High Court which forced, I think, the Ofcom to rethink its approach, and I think that's now probably back in this place to be dealt with. But I don't have any particular views on that, other than to say, that I hope it can be resolved, because it looks to me like that High Court decision was quite worrying for those who worry about it.
I'm keen to move on. I've got Jill, and then I'm going to go back to Mahmood for the supplementary. Jill.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about reasonable limits because it's no, the debate isn't over yet, and I wondered if any of you could suggest to us as a committee what a reasonable limit is and how we would monitor and enforce it.
I mean, I can quick.
No.
So like reviewing like the Committee of Standards of Public Life recommendation in line with talking about reasonable limits. And I think the notable thing about the reasonable limits is, of course, is it sort of tries to sidestep defining what those are. And I think and this is in part why it's useful to lead back to like roles and principles, is because the reason, the obvious ones are limits on time, limits on money. And the trouble is, if you pick either one of those, you can find a role and go like, well, this doesn't apply for this. Like I think the example like not being able to regulate lawyers earning a lot of money because some people write books is sort of the whole of going through the time-based approach. So if you're defining by role, it becomes a bit easier. So I think obviously these things all nicely go together. If you're defining like semi-reasonable limits in terms of money, that works nicely defining some of the role aspects as well. But I think ultimately the reason people struggle to define reasonable limits is because all the roles raise different questions, and so going by role solves some of those questions.
Anyone else?
Yes, I do remember CSPL, they also, in their submission to the, I think it's 2021 Code of Conduct consultation, they also included a rebuttable presumption, which is in a way similar to our ban, in the sense that if there were roles which were more along the lines of public services or professional registrations, which might be above a time limit, they would also be allowed in consultation with the Commissioner. So even those who have advocated for a limit do recognise that there's sometimes a bit of wiggle room for particular roles.
I don't have much to add to what I've already said. I think I'd adopt a rough and ready measure of its private life, which is that it's probably no more than 1/6 of your time. But I'm sure there are situations, especially coming out of a business when you first become an MP, adjustment times, and also keeping up with qualifications that will require more than that. I don't see that as a huge problem. That bit is a huge problem. If we can identify some people that we think we definitely want to be able to attract to Parliament, and that they definitely need to do so much practice. I don't think they're. I mean, I had a quick look, and I actually found it quite hard to find many of them. But anyway, I'm sure there are. And if they need more than 1 day a week, so be it for a time. I think if I were a dentist or something or other and said, I definitely need to go on a course which learns these new techniques, and for several weeks I won't be around very much, but I'll do my best and get my staff to. That would be a reasonable position, I think, to take. And I think if the media made much of that, it wouldn't succeed. When you take leave for a year to go on a celebrity programme, it's rather different, and that's pretty easy to swat, I would have thought. Anyway.
Thank you all of you. Yeah, that's very useful.
Thank you, Jill. Mahmouda.
Good afternoon. Mahmouda Meehan, one of the lay members. Just going back to forms of outside work, do you actually have any concerns about Parliament itself deciding what is deemed acceptable forms of outside work, and particularly since they could impact an MP's parliamentary time and or attention? Start with you,
yes.
Alex. Thank you.
So my general point here is to be concerned about Parliament making decisions where that tends to overvalue the opinions of people who are already. As in, there are a lot of MPs already have second jobs. In general, the average opinion of MPs is more towards allowing things than the average member of the public is. So that would be sort of my concern, is it tilts it a bit too much in favour of that direction. And if there was a serious concerns about if Parliament wanted to do it itself, you could, as other select committees have, the Justice Committee, Home Affairs and Northern Ireland Affairs Committee have convened citizen panels of a representative group to sort of get into the weeds on some of this stuff. If it was a question of like, well, what about this, what about this, what about this? There are ways of deferring the question in a way that would sort of not take it out of hands, but sort of help get into more details in a way that goes beyond big public polling, which can be a bit imprecise, but also take it, it's stand the sort of principle.
Thank you.
I always get a bit muddled here, but I mean, this is a debate which comes up in a number of areas of public life. Internal self-regulation means, I suppose, the House of Commons deciding its own rules and procedures. Anything else seems to require full legislation, undoubtedly outside consultation, advice, and so on. But if it requires full legislation, it's still Parliament which is deciding. I mean, the other house, the other place is involved in it, but it looks quite similar to me. Although I think that we academics and others sometimes say, oh well, they're marking their own homework, they're setting their own rules and so on. I'm not sure that's a very widespread public concern, so I don't feel very strongly about it, I must say. Yeah.
Thank you. Rose?
Thank you. So I think maybe there could be concerns of vested interests. The roles which Parliament overall have could be earmarked as the exemptions. But I would hope that the process would also include the Commissioner as a layer of independence, and also this committee as well, which not only has parliamentarians who have the lived experience of being an MP, but also the lay members on this committee who bring that additional layer of independence in the decision-making process, so that it can't be seen as marking your own homework.
Thank you very much. And then my next question, we have touched upon this a little bit, but for the sake of completeness, I'll ask the question. So what should the rules be regarding outside interests that don't fall into a specific occupation? For example, delivering speeches or writing books. And I know, Professor David, you've already referred to the fact that you don't think you have that considerable worries about delivering speeches or writing books forming part of outside interests. But if I may begin with you.
It seems to be inherent in the role of an elected representative who is not there simply to say, oh, I've heard that from my constituents I must do X. They're there to lead as well. They're to aggregate policies. They're there to make their opinions known, and they do that in all sorts of ways. Obviously, if you are in a privileged position in various ways to disseminate your views compared to other MPs or compared to rival parties or whatever, we worry about that, but we worry about that on many fronts, to do with party funding, to do with the role of leadership versus the role of followership in parties altogether. So, in general, I don't worry too much about it. I expect MPs to do this. As I say, I worry very much about social media and your ability to acquire as it were, a position in public life, maybe acquire it even before you enter formally into public life, and then to be someone who can monetize it, and the relationship is based upon you getting a benefit and you persuading voters that your particular authority is a reason why they should look in a particular direction. And given the sort of polarisation of political life in all advanced democracies, I think that poses risks, really quite serious risks. I think it's the biggest risk in the room, to be honest.
Thank you.
I think it's a really interesting question, and there are some additional trade-offs with sort of speeches and writing newspaper columns and these additional income sources. Because we recognise that parliamentarians can contribute to the public debate through, writing, giving speeches. It's a way to engage with the public in a more informal way, perhaps a more accessible way. For example, a column in a local newspaper. And we wouldn't want to undermine or restrict those types of contributions. But looking from sort of an anti-corruption perspective, we have the sort of two areas of concerns. Firstly, it would be the conflict of interest. If there's a debate, for example, on Ofcom or newspapers, and participating in that debate. But we would hope that those types of conflict of interest would be mitigated by strengthening the lobbying rules and the existing lobbying and declaration and registration rules. But we are also concerned that those offering to pay for speeches or writing, they may have motivations. They may be trying to ingratiate themselves with parliamentarians or use the credibility of parliamentarians to speak on their behalf. And all these payments may be a loophole for undermining the Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act and the acceptance of permissible donations. So it sort of begs the question when these types of payments are actually a donation. If it's not permissible for a foreign media mogul to make campaign donations to a political party, why would it be permissible to employ a parliamentarian and fund these activities such as speeches or writing books in other ways? And I think, we highlighted this in our submission to this committee. But it might be that, the Electoral Commission maybe has a role here. And one way to look at it might be to examine the amount given as the payment. And if it's, a modest amount or maybe an exorbitant amount and is sort of above commercial rates. And there's actually a precedent for doing this in Papira around conference costs, where the Electoral Commission determine what is the reasonable cost for the hire of a stand at party conference. So that's just one example of where you can try and measure what that sort of commercial rate would be to see if it is above the normal one. And as I said, if that's the crutch and risk that they're trying to sort of avoid the impermissible restrictions on donations.
Thank you, Alex.
Yes, I think because it is, I think it's fairly important part of MP's role to be part of shaping that public discussion. I think it sits in a much more ambiguous box than second jobs, and I think having nuanced, fine-grained roles, as Rose talks about, is probably the way forward. I think there's probably an interesting distinction to be made on writing books, where I think it's hard to argue that people can't make royalty payments, but at the same time I think there's a question about MPs accepting advances in before you get to the manuscript stage, on the grounds that that's sort of implicit, please finish this book, spend your time on this, when that's not necessarily what we want. So I think that is potentially something to work in there, just in terms of is this really something that's happening in your own time, and what is going forward from that point.
Thank you so much.
If I can just ask a supplementary to Mahmouda's first question, it's directed at Alex actually, about the impact on MPs' parliamentary time or attention. I think in your written evidence, your helpful written evidence, you said interests interfere with being an MP, and I'm quoting, it means a worse service to constituents because rather than being a full-time MP, they're doing work elsewhere. Is that an opinion, Alex, or is that based on evidence of MPs that have second jobs?
I'm afraid so. We didn't submit written evidence to this committee, so I can't. That may be from something we've written elsewhere. I don't recognise. I believe I wrote it, but I can't speak to it. It would have been based off.
Does it sound like something you might have written?
It sounds very possible, but I can't say it's based. So your actual question, was that based on evidence? If I wrote something like that, it wasn't based on talking to lots of MPs about the distraction.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
So if I wrote that, it wasn't to do with interviewing lots of MPs about the distraction they see from the job. It's just sort of inherent to the if people are deriving significant second income from places, it sort of implies that their attention is spread in different ways, and maybe some people can do. I think there's an inherent fuzziness in.
But there's no evidence to suggest a worse service to constituents is being provided by MPs who have second jobs or interests. That's not what you.
I don't think I would back that up right now. If that's my evidence.
That's very helpful. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you very much, Alex. Sorry. Yeah,
well, if you permit me, Chair, there is a certain amount of academic evidence on this. Some academics have gone around the world trying to measure whether there is better service or worse service, depending on how many outside interests. The answer is it's inconclusive, I think. And the way in which those sorts of things are written, I don't think is going to be terribly helpful to your inquiry. But there is, people have thought about this, and yes. I think you could construct an argument to say you get better service sometimes if people are very engaged, but that's not factoring in the personality element and all sorts of elements.
My own experience, for what it's worth, is my 10 years as an MP, the very occasional times I've had complaints about the service provided by other MPs when they come to me is not those MPs that have second jobs. It's MPs that might be classified as lazy, and there are one or two, as there are in every walk of life.
Sorry, if I could just add something to that on that.
Yes, of course.
There is sort of, and this is sort of like the distinction between the conflict of attention and conflict of interest, is there's some interesting research done on MPs who had significant directorships. And similarly, that led to more attendance in Parliament, in part because they were in London for their second jobs. So, and similarly, like more attendance in votes for the same reason. And I think that's the interesting question here. Is it's not necessarily like, are they doing things? But the way you sort of measure like attendance and stuff, that's not necessarily a good measure of distraction, or because it can sort of come to the same thing. But that's not in the interest of constituents always. So it is a difficult thing to measure. But yes, I agree with the broad point. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alex. Gareth, did you have a supplementary?
I was just making the point on attendance, though, because obviously that doesn't apply to those MPs whose political position is abstention from this place. And so to equate attendance here with a good service would essentially cause all sorts of problems in Northern Ireland. But I genuinely do want to understand, Chair, because we've used the word here about service of an MP, but no one's actually defined what the services of an MP are, and whether there is an agreed understanding of what the services are that MPs provide that are good or worse, depending on attention elsewhere.
I mean, we don't advocate for, a job description or something like that, but I mean, for us, it's not about indicating what the services should be. It's about what behaviour there shouldn't be, and that's around conflict of interest and the corruption risk. So, yeah, for us, it's not about dictating what you should do. It's about looking at those areas that you shouldn't be engaging in.
And similarly, I think we're in favour of a very broad job description, nothing else, just to be a bit clear on what the areas of activity are. But obviously some MPs sit on committees, some don't. Some MPs have government jobs, some MPs are on the... so there is sort of a range of activities in the constituency can also be important. So I think it is important to have a definition in terms of these are a range of permissible activities, but also, as Rose says, that there is a sort of sense what is not really meant to be happening with time. And I think there's sort of the whole interesting separate discussion about MPs as a service, which sort of applies to some aspects of casework, which sort of has developed over the last 50 years and sits oddly with some other definitions of the role. But I think for the purposes of second jobs, it is what's not happening that is more important than a clear description of what should be.
I don't really have anything to add, I'm afraid. I mean, I think what determines how hard MPs work is pretty varied, and it depends, as the Chair says, first of all, whether they're committed to working hard, whether they're lazy. Secondly, I think it depends on where they are in their career and whether they're unhappy and resigned. I think it also depends on how marginal the constituency is. If you're sitting on a majority of 500, you've got to spend a lot more time in a constituency, I think, than if you're sitting on a majority of 20,000. Well, that used to be the case, maybe it's not anymore, but those sorts of things will be behavioural determinants, as it were. What should be the case, I think, would be hard to define, and I think you yourselves train each other and talk to each other about it much more than any outsider could really help you with, I suspect.
I have some supplementary.
Just one quick supplementary from me, and Alex, you might be able to help with this because obviously they work for you, etc. And there has been some interest, I suppose, is the word I would use, in the past about, because obviously you can Google your MP and see how many times they've spoken in the chamber, etc., etc. How many EDMs they sign or whatever. But the role of an MP is far greater than how many times someone speaks in a chamber. And I think, David, you just said about, committees, etc. So for example, I know colleagues who have applied to be on select committees, for example, but the demand and the interest has been that great that unfortunately it goes to a vote and they are unsuccessful in that. And not that I'm suggesting that there's any sort of impropriety going on, but sometimes when you sit in the chamber for 4 and 5 hours and you've prepared a 15-minute speech and you are the last person to be called, for example, and you've had to cut down a 15-minute speech to 2 minutes, sometimes you do have to ask, is that the best use of your time on that particular day when you could be doing a whole range of other activities that fall within the remit of parliamentary duties and are assisting constituents. Is any of that taken into consideration when these figures are released? Because I know that some MPs are sort of hailed as heroes, as having spoken the most in the chamber, and some are hailed as being just complete lazy oafs because they're sort of way down the pecking order. I'd just be interested to understand that.
Sure. In terms of our stuff, the statistics became much vaguer on this almost immediately. So, this was before my time at the organisation, like around 2010, a lot of the stuff was, the explicit rankings died away, and we haven't published what we used to call the numerology section in about 5 years, I don't think.
Which section, sorry?
So we used to call it the numerology section in terms of like all these numbers. We publish a lot less of that than we used to, in part because of these concerns about there is emphasising some aspects of the job over others. And I think we have opinions about like what makes an effective parliament and what makes an effective MP, but those don't always aside with what are the ones that are easiest to measure. So in principle, so in terms of the question, we do a lot less of that than we used to. We don't. It's one of those things that's difficult because it's fuzzy if you pick on any particular instance, but roughly speaking, there are some people who speak a lot less, some people who speak a lot more. That's not to say that people who speak a lot are necessarily that's most of the time, but they have specialised in that way, there is lots of different ways of being an MP, and it's helpful almost for MPs to say, I am this kind of MP, this is what I value. I value my work on the committee, I value my work in the constituency, and sort of what is the standard you want to be judged against.
Yeah.
And that is helpful for us in terms of how we think about things going forward. But there are different kinds of MPs, and it helps to judge what they're trying to do well, to understand what's happening.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Thank you. Alice.
We've heard a lot of information from you today, and I guess I'm almost asking you a question to try and validate my understanding. And I appreciate you're all three individuals and you may have differing opinions, but I've heard a lot of similarity in terms of principles-based is the way to go. That if we do have some additional guidelines, such as reasonable limits of time or money or expectation of what's declared before somebody's elected, that they are used as guidance rather than hard and fast rules, because Alex, you pointed out, well, for some roles it might actually require more at different times of the year, that we actually just provide those guidance to the Commissioner so that when he's undertaking his investigations, he's got something as boundaries, but also MPs have something where they can sense check what they're doing in terms of outside work. Would that be a fair summary of some of the key information you've given to us today, or is there some nuance I've missed out there?
Well, for me, it's a fair summary. I guess I've taken my cue in everything that I wrote and what I've said here from the Modernisation Committee and its intent. It's very keen on what it calls a principles-based system. And in a way, if we'd been sitting here in 30-something years ago, when Lord Nolan had just enunciated his principles, we would have said that, and we would have said that principles and self-regulation is the right way to go. And I must say, after Lord Nolan's report and the principles, their enunciation in the code, you might say, oh yes, that was a good self-regulatory principles-based system, although it did depend on the elucidation of more and more precise rules over time to make sure that people understood what the Code of Conduct actually meant, and to give the Parliamentary Commissioner something to get his or her teeth into when difficult cases arose. So, I think what I conclude from that, that principles are the overriding set of, they're the generalities that we're aiming at, and they are the, if you like, the ethical basis of what the rules are trying to do. But in certain areas, you'll certainly need rules. And I think that there's going to be a difficulty where the principle doesn't necessarily lead to a particular rule. I still think that's the case with full attention, with the full attention principle. I don't have any problems with the others. I think, the Code of Conduct itself and parts of it deal with the monetisation and the conflict of interest and can be used. There's a read across. I don't think there's an easy read across with full attention. I think it may have to sit there as a principle, and run the risk that it's a principle that gets Parliament into a bit of disrepute precisely because it isn't, if you like, enforceable, justiciable, whatever you like to call it. It's just sitting there as something that we hope MPs will have full regard to, with the qualifications that are put around it about what you can do as an outside interest. But it's the principle which will be bearing the weight there rather than the rules underneath it, unless rules are found, but I suspect they can't be found. I don't know whether that helps. I mean,
yeah, it's just I'm very thoughtful always. I've been regulated, I'm being a regulator, and I'm always thoughtful about putting rules in place that are easy to understand, easy to implement, and easy to enforce to make everything fair and consistent. Because you don't put rules in place to catch people out. You put rules in place because the majority of people want to do the right thing, and they want that guidance around it. And I'm very thoughtful as a committee member about that, and that's why I was so interested in your opinions. I mean, Alex, I don't know if you've got something to build on top of that.
Just that the general idea that there does need to be. It's useful for everyone to have guidelines about how they should be behaving in ambiguous circumstances because people want to do the right thing, but ultimately to change like the overall shape of what's happening across. To change the overall picture on second jobs, harder rules are required to make differences to people who are. Yes, in principle, if there are things that actively want to be discouraged, there need to be rules about that. If there are things, it's just like that there is genuine ambiguity here, say stuff around speeches and writing, where it's like this is an ambiguous space, that's incredibly useful to have principles about like what to consider. But when it's like this is something that we want to happen less, needs a bit more than transparency and a bit more than it needs to say this is something we've decided is not allowed.
As a committee, when we're putting rules in place, being very clear what the risk is that we're trying to mitigate.
Yes.
Right, that's really helpful. Thank you, Rose.
Yeah, so just to echo what I said previously, I think that our stance would be that introducing additional principles only would not be enough. We would like to see a few tightening of the rules around lobbying, around secondary employment, and I think it echoes something in your question you were saying, the rules are a protection because they create clear expectations of what behaviour is expected. And it's those rules rather than the principles which more create that protection and clear expectations, I think.
Thank you.
We haven't, of course, mentioned the fact that we've got a few system of government parliament here, and of course most ministers are members of the House of Commons. Do you have any comments about that in respect of conflict of attention? If we do decide to go down that route, how would we ensure that those people that are ministers are not prejudiced by demonstrating perhaps a conflict of attention with their MP role? How would you propose to do that?
I don't think I could. I mean, I didn't note in my evidence that there was one very big exception, and if you justify it in terms of contribution to parliamentary life, it's the biggest contribution of all. It's the essence of parliamentary government. If you want your executive not to be the bureaucrats who sit in the Bellymore, but elected representatives, one of all of you, members of the House, which gives the system its democratic legitimacy, you've got to devolve to them the responsibility to be ministers and ultimately Prime Minister. I don't really have a problem with that. I think it's just a fact of life. I've never been in a constituency, I think, in my life where there has been an MP who's been a minister, so I've never felt particularly deprived as a constituent. But that argument hasn't come up in my lifetime very much. It's just a fact of parliamentary life. And I think it's a good thing. Personally.
Yes. So in response to our main recommendation, we do hear this a lot, that, well, obviously some parliamentarians take up ministerial roles, so if they can take that on as a time commitment, then other secondary employment should be allowed. I think it's interesting to note, though, that once a parliamentarian becomes a minister, there are a number of things they can no longer do. Speaking in debates, asking questions in Parliament, serving in select committees. Lots of the activities of being an MP are suspended whilst a minister. And if and when they are no longer ministers, their constituents might expect that their free time would now be filled with these MPs' duties again. There is a lot of time commitment which is freed up when they become a minister from the suspension of those MPs' duties as well.
Hey, Alex.
Just that I think it is a different type of second job in the sense that the employer is effectively the same. There isn't a conflict in terms of where the money comes from. It's still coming from everyone. But I think the interrelated question here is it's a bit related to the dual mandate question in terms of serving as mayors, as councillors, as members of devolved parliaments. So I think there's a question like, are there different constituencies involved? Is that a particular thing to get into it in terms of I think councillors is more approved of than other kinds of second jobs from the YouGov poll. But that is sort of related to the question about things that are elected roles, elected democratic roles that might never conflict with aspects of MPs' roles is a sort of, I'd say, an interesting but distinct question from accepting private employment.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the final area now, media appearances. Sir Francis.
The first question I want to ask is about whether media appearances create particular difficulties. And David, you answered that question a bit when my colleague David asked a question. But Alex and Rose, do you think that sort of media appearances are something that causes particular difficulties in terms of secondary employment? Alex?
So I'd say it causes a different kind of difficulty in the sense that it's in that ambiguous space that you can clearly say some aspect of this is entirely appropriate inside an MP's role. At the same time, because of that ambiguous space, there is grounds for abusing that. I think my contribution to this would be that it would be useful to separate, if we decide media appearances are a legitimate form of work, separating that out in the register of members' interest would be an enormous help with appropriate fields to capture that kind of work, because it is distinct from large ongoing employment. So that if it is legitimate, capture it better.
I think similar to my answer on speeches and writing, it again would be to ask whether or not these media appearances are a donation by another name. Are they just sort of an act of patronage? Additional to what Alex has highlighted, I would add that.
David, did you want to add anything, Darren?
No, I mean, I was very struck by something that happened in a previous hearing of this committee when the Commissioner pointed out that what you'll need to think about is what roles in the media give somebody an automatic added authority, and whether or not that's something you particularly worry about. The days of Sir Geoffrey Johnson-Smith, most of you won't remember, who became a Conservative MP, are long gone, where they immediately step aside from their media roles. Indeed, it seems to go the other way now, and I think it does. There is a sort of false authority there, which is given by people who are MPs, and I think the public probably struggles to understand that. Whether that's something that you should engage with, I don't know. I think it's a difficult one, a very, very difficult one, and I worry about the blowback, which may come possibly from the other side of the Atlantic as well, about freedom of speech when you start involving yourself in that. I mean, I really do worry that we are living in a very dangerous period for democracy, and you have to think of all those sorts of things when you make moves of this type. I think certain individuals may blow themselves out more easily than being put out, if I can put it like that.
Lovely, thank you, Sir Francis. Are there any other questions that have been asked that the committee might like to ask the panel? No? Are there any other points that haven't been made that you would like to explain to the committee?
So just in terms of the effectiveness of the transparency system of the register of interest, so as I said, we went through this exercise, we volunteers to go through it, try to understand what's going in there and to run into obstacles in terms of the data quality. One of the things we think is important is that Parliament should take more of a collective interest in the standard of that data quality. At the moment, it's sort of seen as a sort of very much an individual's responsibility, that it's on you to declare accurately and informatively. But, as I said, the risk is collective when things aren't easily understood, and so there should be an interest in how can the quality of data be raised in terms like systematic efforts to prompt MPs to update previous entries or to periodically do an audit of what makes sense. That's, again, not to catch anyone out, just to understand, like, these people that do not understand this form correctly, how do we change that guidance? How do we get that better? So just in terms like, if transparency is the solution to balancing these different principles, it has to be done well, and that has to be seen as a collective exercise, not an individual one.
I completely agree with. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I completely agree with that, Chairman. One thing we haven't really talked about much is transparency today. We keep touching on it, but it's not really quite within the remit of the Modernisation Committee, I guess, at the moment. But the quality. I personally would be in favour of a sort of publication of a Sunday Times rich list as applied to outside earnings. You know, if it could become authoritative, the Sunday Times rich list is amazingly up there ahead of everybody else. I mean, it may be spurious in all sorts of ways, but people pay attention to it. I'd love to see a list which became authoritative and became the go-to place to kind of understand how much your MP is doing.
Unfortunately, it goes two ways. I was billed by the media in Leicestershire as the highest earning MP without a second job. It was merely donations to my association. So one's got to be careful that... but an interesting point. The final word to Rose. Rose, any final comment?
Thank you. What an honour. So, yeah, my additional point would have been transparency as well. So there have been some recent changes to how the Register of Members' Financial Interests is published. It's now downloadable, which we welcome. I think this committee also were advocating for that for a long time. But there are just some few improvements which I think would be quite easy to implement but would make a big difference, which is just simply, for example, how the data is collected. So there's more consistency, for example, in hours worked, because sometimes it will be per month or per week or per year, and trying to analyse that becomes really difficult. But if, when the data is collected, it's more consistent, that would alleviate the issue completely.
Lovely. Well, on behalf of the Committee on Standards, can I take this opportunity to thank you for what's been a lengthy session with you, and a very informative session. So just before I move into private session of the committee, order, and thank you.